Niigaan, you there? Hey, I've got some good news and some bad news.
Lay it on me.
Well, you know how we arranged for a very prominent journalist from a national news organization to appear as a guest on the podcast?
Yeah. I thought it was a really, as they say, good get. I'm looking forward to that interview.
Well, I hate to tell you this, but he called to say he can't do it. Seems that his organization has its own podcast and doesn't allow its journalists to appear on competing podcasts.
What? That's totally stupid. Like, how can you find any good news in that?
Well, just think about this for a minute. We lost an interview, but 8 episodes into our podcast, somebody actually thinks we're a competitor. Woohoo! They see us as a threat. We finally hit the big time.
Yeah, I'm not really sure that means what you think it means, but let's go with it for now. Welcome to Niigaan and the Lone Ranger, a note of caution for other podcasters. We're coming for you.
The Winnipeg Free Press proudly presents, in partnership with CJNU 93.7 FM, Niigaan and the Lone Ranger. Here are your hosts, Niigaan Sinclair and Dan the Lone Ranger Lett.
Welcome to the 9th episode of the Niigaan and Lone Ranger podcast. And we made it to 9, Dan. Can you believe it?
Yeah, like we are so perilously close to double digits. I can barely contain myself. And when I say they say it can't be done, there were quite a few people actually who said that that this would not be still going on and as long as it has been, but it has become my major professional reason for living. So I can't give it up.
Well, speaking of things that said couldn't be done, we are in the wake of a very significant federal leader visit here in Winnipeg. Pierre Poilievre spent this past week in Winnipeg, and much talked about, much ink in our newspaper was run around Poilievre's visit to Winnipeg. And this has all sparked all interest, all hands on deck for the upcoming provincial election this October. And I've even heard rumors that they may call it a little bit earlier, but Winnipeg and Manitoba is just a buzz these days.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always a possibility of an earlier election. That by law, it has to be held by late October. So the prevailing theory is that Premier Heather Stefanson will drop a budget, which she has already teased us, that will have lots more tax cuts. And for everybody waiting for hip and knee surgery, they couldn't be more thrilled about more tax cuts coming. So having Mr. Poilievre here certainly focused everybody's attention on the political scene, and I will say that, like, he very quietly and somewhat surprisingly did media interviews, which he had notoriously not been doing, and which that was kind of a ship that we somehow missed. But I am prepared to say that along with Will Arnett, I am now adding Pierre Poilievre to the list of prominent people that I'm daring to come on the podcast. So I will be unleashing the hounds of Twitter hell. I'm going to put in an email to his comms guy and say, hey, we kind of missed your guy. We missed him. That's on us. That's our bad. But we'd really love to have you on the podcast.
I like to take a little credit for that. Not me, but the paper per se, because he did most frequently say no media, and of course our reporter reported that, and then of course changed his tune. So I want to know, how did that happen and so on. I mean, he certainly did about a half dozen outlets and different pieces and so on. But this week is also, as it seems to be a regular occurrence in Winnipeg, kind of a tragic anniversary. It's a tragic anniversary because this was the week in which 1 year ago, the Patel family, they're an immigrant family from India, tried to use Manitoba as a stopover. Canada, then Toronto, then Manitoba as a stopover to migrate south to enter into the United States. And then, of course, very tragically, just near the United States-Canada border, trying to travel. I mean, anyone who lives here knows that it's very dangerous during certain times of the year. And people like to think it's like all the time, but it's not really. It's only a few weeks a year. It is very, very dangerous to be outside. And unfortunately, the Patel family perished upon trying to make that journey. And it really spotlighted the issue of immigration, the fact that there's an immigration backlog in the country, the fact that there is many people across the world that want to come to Canada, that Canada does do we do our fair share of immigration to Canada, but yet still Canada could do more in lots of different ways to support immigrants. And of course, all the different reasons that people immigrate is often poverty brought on by first world nations.
Yeah, I mean, I think immigration is a super hot story. And even though I personally don't think there will be a federal election this year, you can never say never, but immigration, I think, is going to be a huge watershed issue in the next federal election. So you have a federal government that's increasing the total quota on immigrants in all classifications coming into the country. You have various steps the federal government is making to alleviate the more than 2 million applications through the immigrant and refugee system that remain sort of backlogged. And then that's everything from visa applications to student visas to permanent and temporary residence and everything. But still, like that it's a dangerous administrative threat to a major policy plank that the Liberals want to bring in. And I expect the rhetoric and hyperbole around immigration to reach dangerous levels. And I think, definitely I would expect the Conservative Party to see it as a wedge issue with which to beat the Liberals about the head and shoulders.
There's about 3 dozen people who come to Manitoba to try to get into the United States and then often get caught. And those are just the people that get caught. So we don't know, of course, the undocumented people that come to Manitoba and then travel across the border. And so it is a very uniquely Manitoba issue, as well as, of course, other places across country that have people that try to cross. But I mean, it is uniquely very much something that we're focused on in Manitoba, and it must be dealt with in an appropriate, in a humane way that respects the context of what people are going through as a result of having to come to this place to try to, illegally enter the United States. And I'm certainly not interested in any discourse around walls. But I am interested in trying to figure out ways to support people more appropriately so that we don't have to go to dire circumstances for people to risk their lives.
Yeah, I think that what makes immigration such an interesting issue in provinces like, well, particularly Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, the Great Plains, as the Tragically Hip would call it, is like I've actually, for stories, I've been down to the border many, many times, and there are areas of the border where literally you're driving along a road that goes east-west, and right in the ditch, right beside the road, is a cement marker that marks the border between Canada and the United States. And I mean, literally, you're standing there. I remember going down with a photographer years ago, and we were, hey, look, hop on one foot. I'm in Canada. Hop on the other foot. I'm in the United States. Like, it's crazy. And so as far as like security is concerned, like I would be surprised if people weren't trying to walk across the border. There's only so much patrolling that can be done, drones, helicopters, vehicles. I mean, I think both sides do as much as they can, but it is also one of the great features of the relationship between the two countries on this continent that we have an undefended border like this, and we don't have a border wall. And I mean, I would be horrified if any political leader from any party thought that a fence or a wall was a thing that they.
Well, there's already electronic means. I mean, there's all the different sort of invisible fences, as it were. And I'm more interested in how can we set up a situation for people to be successful, so that they don't have to go to such dire circumstances. But speaking of dire circumstances is the Canadian housing market, which the Canadian Real Estate Association came out just in the past 24 hours and have said that the housing prices in Canada nationally have dropped 12%. Inflation has flattened around 6%. But interestingly enough, the housing market, I think largely because the interest rates in Canada keep being raised. Apparently there's going to be another raise in about a week or so, is cooling the housing market, but it's now influencing prices. And the leading place, of course, impacts Vancouver and Toronto, probably the most double-digit drops in pricing. But our neighbor just to the west of us, Regina, has seen a 20% loss in value in houses. They're under $300,000 for an average house in Regina. And we may be, in a bit of a stagnant situation here in Winnipeg, only 1% drop in price in Winnipeg. But what do you say about all these housing drops? And we are facing a recession, of course. The major thing that people put their money in for their investment in the future is housing. And it seems to be a loss in value, quite almost like a rock dropping.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're back to the future, right? I mean, when I bought my first house in the early 1990s, we bought a house in a lovely neighborhood, lovely house, for about $17,000 less than the person who bought it had paid for it. And at that time, interest rates were higher. They're about as high as they are now, but the housing market in Winnipeg was just the shits. And, flash forward to, the second house that I bought, was the first, house where that involved a 6-figure price tag. But, when my wife and when we sold it 10 years later, it had more than doubled in price. So it's what goes up must come down. I think the fascinating thing for me is people are lamenting the loss of housing value. Inflation, interest rates have certainly driven that. But we haven't actually fallen to a point where we've been able to really address the shortage of affordable housing in the city. And in this city and other cities, right now it's still too expensive for most people to buy a home. The high interest rates, which are used to combat inflation, are actually, that's what I mean. It's actually making housing less affordable. Even as the price of housing goes down, the cost of carrying a home has gone up. So, this is an extraordinary conflict in macro forces. And, I know the federal government is investing billions of dollars, but personally, I don't think the provinces are nearly engaged enough in this. There was a federal government announced a project last week in Winnipeg, $17.4 million to build a 7-story building on Yonge Street, 69 affordable units. The Apasquack Cree Nation is involved in this project, and Apasquack's providing $1.8 million. The feds are providing 15.6 in funding, and the province, I guess it's the price of getting on the podium to make the announcement, $105,000. That's not the extent of what the province is doing on affordable housing, but it is kind of indicative of the fact that they need to get in the game.
I was just listening to an amazing podcast on the Frequency Podcast Network called The Big Story. And I totally recommend everybody, if you want to get a primer on what housing bubbles look like. And it's a fantastic podcast. I did it to listen and to try to figure out, because everyone always talks about a housing bubble. And when they get into numbers like 13% drop in prices, that sounds like a bubble bursting. But what the market in Canada, if it doesn't have quite the kind of volatility the United States has, because what it does is it has what we would refer to as a deflation of the bubble versus a popping of the bubble, meaning you often see these 10 to 15% variations in price. It really depends on when you get in on the market. And a large part of it has to do with the ways in which civic governments control taxation, and then of course the ways in which things like the changing of neighborhoods. What's that word when they change the neighborhoods? Gentrification, and the way gentrification is working in the country, and a large part is because of the social network. So because of the social network that we have, the fact that we all pay taxes in relatively fair amounts for the most part, the fact that we have governments that think socially about the welfare of all, that's why we don't see the kind of drops and crashes like the United States faces, where people are literally kicked out onto the street. So I hope that people notice that, yes, right now 13% drop, but yet homes are still somewhat affordable, and it's because of the social network in the country that kind of keeps us in tune, that people are still not having to go and work someplace or lose their jobs or because they can't afford their own homes.
Yes, and hey, listen, thanks for showing the audience once again that my true value is in a supporting role as the thesaurus. Why don't you tell us about our feature interview today?
So we've been trying to get this interview for a while. We've been teasing it a little bit on a previous podcast. We were able to get National Chief RoseAnne Archibald, who the first female chief of the Assembly of First Nations, much embattled during her term, having conflicts with regional chiefs, with the what's called the National Indian Brotherhood board. There is a lot of information around the Assembly of First Nations that I think has been talked about in the past little while, much of it involving conflict. And so we invited RoseAnne Archibald to come on, not just to talk about that controversy, but then also to talk about her vision. She's got about a year and a half left of her term as the first female national chief. And we talked to her a little bit about what she's looking forward to, but then also, of course, the issues that involve Winnipeg and the ongoing issue around the Brady landfill, the searching for Indigenous women, and the issue of murder missing Indigenous women and girls. And so a really wonderful interview. We're very lucky to get such an amount of time with her. The interview was almost an hour long. So what we've done is we've edited that down for the podcast, but we're going to upload the full interview. So you can just go to the description on our the Free Press page, and you'll see that there's access to where we can upload the full version, which was almost an hour.
And first, before we get to this great interview, we have another episode of The Storytellers.
Hi, my name is Giovanni LaGioia, and I own Giovanni Custom Tailor at 726 Osborne Street in Winnipeg. And this is The Storyteller. In October 1976, my wife pressured me to go see Elvis. I'm not a big fan, but we had to go, so we drove down to Minneapolis to see Elvis Presley. If I remember correctly, the tickets were $15 each. The gas cost more. When we got there and the arena, our seats they were on the side of the stage. And my wife thought, because we had just a small camera, my wife thought maybe you can go closer before he comes on stage on the side, because he comes from the back of the stage. So if I can get a couple pictures, and then she won't bother me no more. So I went down, and there were lots of girls all around a rope. And I asked these girls if they don't mind to let me go in the front, close to the rope, so I can take some couple pictures and leave. I won't bother them no more. I guess they felt sorry, so they let me go in the front. And after a while, we were waiting. This lady comes out looking good from the back of the stage. She was a blonde lady with a fur jacket. She comes by me on the rope there. There were security people all over the place. And I said to her, I said jokingly, "Who are you to come out from the back of the stage?" And she turned around to me and said, "Hi, I'm Linda Thompson." I said, "Nice to meet you. I'm Giovanni LaGioia." "Who are you?" She said, "I'm Elvis' girlfriend." I said, "Oh, that's nice. Nice to meet you. Can you do me a favor?" She said, "What?" "Can you tell the security guard if I can come over the rope so I can take some pictures of Elvis and go sit down so my wife will be happy?" She said, "Sure." So she talked to the security guard. She let me go over the rope. And then I asked Linda if I can have a picture with her. Otherwise, my wife won't believe me if I tell her that. And she said, "Sure." So we give the camera to the security guard. And she put her arms around me, and we have a picture together. All of a sudden, the music was going, and Elvis comes out with some guys beside him. He looked very nervous, and as soon as he started going up the steps, to go on stage, you turn around and you see his girlfriend, I guess, there, and me beside her, and he pointed a finger towards us. Now, I know it wasn't me, probably. He was to his girlfriend to say, okay, I got this. To me, he looked like one of the guys that go on stage the first time. He looked scared, I'm going to be good, I'm going to be bad, He looked like a nervous child go on stage for the first time. Elvis, he was Elvis for a long, long time, but I don't think he believed that himself. He was overweight. He looked puffy. I watched the concert from Hawaii on TV a long time ago, and he didn't look like that. No, it was the end of his life, but he played over 2.5 hours straight, no break, no this stage, elaborate stage we have today, just a plywood stage. But he probably was one of the last concerts, and I didn't know that. And a few months later, when he died, and the news came on the radio, it hit me a little bit. Okay, it's like I lost a friend, because the concert was amazing. Okay, like I say, I'm not an Elvis follower, but I think he had an incredible voice, and he was one of a kind. My sister-in-law, my wife's sister, she was a big fan of Elvis, and she went to Memphis, to Graceland, after he died. And Elvis' uncle used to be on the little thing in front of the gate, I guess for security. He wrote a book about Elvis. She said to him, my brother-in-law and my sister saw Elvis in Minnesota. And I don't think that book, it was for sale. I think that book, it was to give to people that he knew, stuff like that. So he gave a book to my sister-in-law to give it to me. So I have the book still in the box with one of the white silk scarf Elvis used to give, folded around the book.
Bonjour and welcome to our interview here with National Chief RoseAnne Archibald. We're very pleased to welcome you to the Niigaan and Lone Ranger podcast. Thanks for coming on the trail.
Happy to be here.
I understand right now, National Chief Archibald, you're coming to us from BC, and you're on Tsleil-Waututh Nation territories out there. It's such a great chance to talk to you. I know you've been very busy and on the trail doing different work. For those of people who don't know, National Chief Archibald was formerly elected as chief of her community, Tagamu Nation, in 1990, the first woman and youngest Anishinaabe Oski Nation deputy grand chief in 1991, and then the youngest grand chief of the Mushkegowuk Council in 1994. National Chief Archibald, there's so many firsts behind your name. I could just sort of like list all these different firsts. And of course, first female national chief of the AFN. What does it feel like to be so many firsts?
It feels very normal for me now, because it's a life path that I've been on since I was really young. And so when I became the first woman and youngest chief in my community, that felt like a moment. And I also realized at that time that it somehow wasn't right that I was the first and youngest. Well, maybe the youngest is different, but certainly being the first woman in 1990 seemed not right. And so I really became dedicated to the idea that we need more women in leadership. And so I started to follow that path. But the path is not something that I always felt like I chose. I felt like the path in some way was choosing me as well, because people would reach out to me and ask me to do these different roles. And so I never actually sort of chased down anything. I was always, which is very much a feminine kind of approach, where you're you're not sort of, out there pushing, you're more like receptive and present in a moment. And I think that that has sort of led me down these many roads where I happen to be the first. And each time it was always difficult. And it's always been challenging to be the first woman. And what I learned after a few of these opportunities to create space for women is how much I needed to focus on that as a leader, to create space for other women to be the second and the third. And then eventually my vision is that it'll just be so normal for any woman to run for any position and be elected, and not have this sort of special title that, oh, we have a woman national chief again, or we have a woman grand chief, that it becomes very normalized.
Having, of course, I'm the son of Murray Sinclair, who is in so many ways the first of many things as well, too. Namely, the first Indigenous judge of Manitoba, second in Canada, and then, of course, all the other things that my father has done. One of the things that I've witnessed is when you're the first, you spend much of your career, not all of it, but a great deal of it, dealing with all the things that have been the reason why you are the first, like all of the stereotypes, all of the obstacles, all of the attitudes that often were within a workplace. And so, you're a woman in a historically run, well, a series of them, but particularly the Assembly of First Nations, historically very male dominated. Have you, since your time in office, been experiencing, engaging, changing, challenging many of these things that have led the organization in the past to be very male dominated?
Yes, the AFN has been particularly challenging for me as a leader. And I mean, I'm in my, and even when I wasn't in elected leadership, I also have to let you know that I've always worked with chiefs, grand chiefs, regional chiefs. I've always been, my life work is around leadership, and either being the leader myself or supporting leaders, giving them advice. Excuse me. So my work is centered around First Nation leadership. And so in that, I am now, and I look back even to when I was a student, because that's really where it started in 1988, when I went on my first political fast to protest at that time changes to the education funding for First Nation students. And so, we're talking about, I'm going into my 35th year of doing this work. And so each level has its own challenges, but the AFN has been particularly difficult because it is so directly connected to the colonial system. It's a real immediate interface with the federal government, the prime minister, cabinet ministers, the Senate, like all of that whole colonial structure is the purpose of AFN's existence, is to interface with that system. And so certainly colonialism, patriarchy, all of those things have infiltrated all of our systems, but particularly it's impacted the Assembly of First Nations. So when I came in there as a regional chief, I really felt that. I felt like, wow, this system is not very welcoming to women, and that there aren't enough women. There hadn't been enough women in these roles. And what were we going to do to try and change that? And so in order to really have that kind of impact, it's not enough for me at that time as a regional chief to say to the national chief, hey, these things have to change. You really need to be the woman in charge to enact those changes, to have that authority to make those changes. So some of the things that we've done that might seem maybe not small, but people might not understand the significance of them, is the name change. So corporately, we were known as the National Indian Brotherhood, Inc., which goes back to the historical ties to the National Indian Brotherhood, which started around the time of the White Paper. And so there is some history there. At the same time, that name really signified to women, youth, 2SL, anybody who wasn't a man, that they didn't have a space in this organization. And so when we changed the name in this past December, it might feel like, oh, the name changed, but words matter. You know, words
sure,
dictate the environment. Words dictate the atmosphere that we're in. And so changing the name is going to be a shift. And there isn't, we haven't settled on the name. It's in the resolution, but I think there's still some work to do around that. And so that to me is a big change, even though it might seem like a small change. The other thing we did at the start of my term is we established what's called the National Caucus of Women Leaders. At the time we established it, we called it Elected Women Leaders, but then we got feedback that it's really about a national caucus of women leaders, whether they're a grand chief, a chief, a counselor, a recognized leader in another form, that there was a space for them at the AFN to caucus, to come together, to talk about things that matter to them as a caucus. And so that happened really early on. We got funding for that within a few weeks of my being elected. We also established the 2SL Plus Council, which also created space for a diverse group of individuals who either had a gender identification or a sexual orientation, or, you know, it just encompasses a whole group that really hasn't been respected or acknowledged within the structure. So in this time of making these changes, it's really, that's been my focus, is to come in and say, hey, you know, this organization has to change. It has to become better. It has to become healthier. It has to become inclusive. And we have to create space and mechanisms so that anybody can think, I want to work at the AFN, or I would like to be a leader at the AFN. I would like to be a regional chief, or I would like to be the national chief. I'd like to be on the board. I want to be on a committee, whatever it is. I want people to feel like, hey, there's a space for me there's a space for my voice. And to me, that kind of corporate cultural shift is an important part of what I've been doing since I've been elected. And so, but it's been met with resistance. It's not been easy to go through these things. And I certainly have felt that, you know, I've experienced resistance at every level, but at the AFN level, it's been really, really difficult. And I have attributed to many things, but one of them is that colonial system that we're interfacing with on a daily basis.
You know, I was talking with you just before we started the recording here today about the fact that you and I both share a past in theater. And, you know, we both share that kind of study of human relationships, or that study of people and conflict. And it says a lot, I think, that you've spent a lot of time dealing with human conflict recently. I mean, you're right to say that there is a lot of resistance to what shouldn't really be resisted. The idea that women are in leadership in our communities, because if you go to the lodge and you spend time in our territories, it is the women who are keeping our communities going. They're the ones who are doing, frankly, most of the work, most of the heavy lifting. And when it comes to our ceremonies, it is women who are the decision makers. They're the ones who are the grandmothers, particularly, but then also other women too. I mean, the first person in my family is not my father. It is my mother. My mother is the one who makes decisions for all of us, of everything from when we will arrive to what we will do to what food, what gifts we'll be presenting to the drum. So it shouldn't be resisted, but so much of your time has been spent resisting or challenging some of the things that have happened within your time. I'm thinking about the suspension, the controversial suspension that was covered very heavily by media. The idea that there's been some human resource issues at the assembly, as well as the fact that you've brought forth new plans to analyze some of the finances within the organizations. Do you find that right now in your term, there's a disproportionate time spent on dealing with the internal things within AFN and not so much the external things?
We are dealing with external things every day. It just doesn't make headlines, right? We are working every single day on every issue that's facing our people. It's just that the media is not interested in reporting on that.
Do you think? Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point, because when I was talking with Dan, my partner on the podcast, the Lone Ranger of our in our title, the first thing that we were talking about is what are the approaches we're going to take with this interview, and he of course wants to talk about all the things that have been covered in the media, because most people probably, if they've heard about the AFN for the past year and a half, they're not hearing about some of the external stuff, which I'll ask you about in just a second, particularly around the issue of murder missing Indigenous women here in Winnipeg. But most people have heard about the internal conflict. Why do you think the media is so obsessed about the internal conflict at AFN and not so interested in some of the external stuff?
There's a thing called clickbait, because we're in a digital world where you and I talked about people don't really read newspapers anymore. They get their news sources from online or through television. And so I think clickbait and stopping people so that advertisers can reach these people is a part of why the media exists. And it's a source of revenue for them. And so sensationalism is really what attracts people's attention. They want the media, I'm saying, or the people who own the media need revenue from advertisers. And how do you get people to look at that advertising? Well, you make them stop. You make them look at something that might be more interesting. So the fact, for example, we have worked on a number of issues for women in the last year. We've had a number of things move forward in a good way, but the media won't ever really do a story on that. They'll do a story on something that will make people stop whatever they're doing to read their story, to scan through all those advertisements.
Well, yeah, I'm thinking about the gathering in BC, where there was the discussion around the very controversial suspension was overturned by the membership and so on. I mean, I'd never seen so many media at an AFN gathering, other than maybe an election.
It's true. And I think that it's important to look at this moment in history and utilize this moment for something good. So if all eyes are on me, then I want to talk about things that are important, like MMIWG, which I know we're going to talk about in a minute. I want people to understand that First Nations have really come through a history of oppression, a history of trauma, multi-generational trauma that is still playing out today. We're seeing the reverberations of colonialism, of those former institutions of assimilation and genocide. These things that we are coming out of and living through are so much a part of our existence that we really have to let people know that there's more to First Nations people than the stereotypes, as you said earlier, or these, sensational stories that might come out. And so I'm hoping that I can use this platform to bring attention to really important issues as needed, which I do. And so when we think about July, and even I noticed this in July, but I also noticed it in December, that when it comes to my speeches, the room fills up. Like it goes right to the back of the room. It's full right to the rafters. But then when I finish my speech, a lot of people leave. They just leave the room, and the room ends up half empty as we go through the business, because people are, and I think about that. I think, okay, what am I going to say in this moment to reach all of these people? And so my efforts are always about healing, that I'm trying to create a sense of connection between us and regular people that are non-Indigenous out there, for them to understand us and to stand with us, to be our allies, to have empathy for us, and for us to begin to really solve these long-standing problems that have existed for First Nations for decades and decades and decades. That's what this moment for me is about, is to make sure that the platform is used properly to advance First Nations rights, to advance and help First Nations people, to lift up women, to lift up youth, to lift up 2SL, to lift up our men. I mean, I'm doing all of these changes despite real resistance in a male dominated form. And that tells you that there are many of my brothers that I call my fellow chiefs who are male. I think of them as my brothers because I grew up with a lot of brothers. I grew up with 6 brothers. And so I think of my brothers as being, many of my brothers saying, yeah, it's time for change. It's time for us to move forward in a good way. So a good example of that is a resolution that we passed in December asking for more transparency around contracts, which has become an issue in the media and is a subject of actual lawsuits right now. And that resolution said that the chiefs have a right to see those contracts and that they will get quarterly reports on those contracts. And to me, that was actually voted almost by 100% consensus. There was one person who abstained from that resolution, I believe, and didn't even go on the record. I don't think that they wanted to go on the record. I don't recall, but those kind of things are happening in a male dominated system. So that means many of our brothers are standing with people outside of the brotherhood to make these changes. And it's an important time right now. And the fact that the AFN is garnering a lot of attention, I think in the long run, even though it's difficult for me as a national chief to walk through this and to know that some of the stories out there are not true or that they're slanted a certain way, I still think of the greater good of what this kind of attention can do to help First Nations to lift up our people.
I think, and I wrote about this in one of my columns, is I think there's 2 ways to see or multiple ways to see everything, but 2 ways to see that particular intervention that was by the AFN Youth Council during all of that discussion around the suspension and all the other things that were perhaps not looked at as much. But when the Youth Council came up and stood up and said, we really want you to be dealing with these issues, and they listed them off, and that's what I want to spend time talking about. But the focus you could take on that is, oh, they're complaining. But the other approach that you could take is someone gave them the microphone, or that someone facilitated an opportunity for the youth who we've never often heard from at the AFN, or not often anyways, not enough anyways, that you suddenly heard the youth voicing that expression, and someone had to make that happen. And that happening for the first time in many ways at the AFN means it's not just a bunch of people who are in power already, it's those who are seeking to create space within that larger structure. And so I think that there's multiple ways to see this so-called conflict that's happening, and also see it as an opportunity for that change, and then also look at the changes that are taking place within those councils you spoke about, the committees and so on. I want to move on to the list, and we don't have much time, of course, to deal with these issues in a really thorough way, but I can't deny that right now here on Treaty 1 territory, we have an issue with an encampment at the landfill site here in the city involving the murders of 2 women in particular, but 4 by an alleged serial killer of Indigenous women and girls here in Winnipeg. What is the AFN doing to deal with the issue? Of course, not just with the larger issue of murder missing Indigenous women and girls across the country, but it seems to be ground zero here in Winnipeg of the front line of the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. Is the AFN doing something about that here, intervening, supporting families here? We're particularly close on the podcast with Sandra Delarond, who we've had as a guest before, who's engaged the issue and, of course, works with the family, particularly of the Harris family. What's the AFN doing around this issue, particularly here in Winnipeg?
My key focus for the remainder of my term, I'm halfway through my term, almost on today. And so I have a year and a half left on my term. And my key focus will be MMIWG, and as well as MMIW boys and Two-Spirited people. like it's women that are going missing, but so are our men, and so are our two-spirited people. And this is going to be my focus for the remainder of my term. It's really one of the top items that I'll be dealing with. And we know that Indigenous women are targets of a genocide. That's what the National Inquiry on MMIWG said. They called it a genocide. It is a genocide. It's an ongoing genocide. And so I did meet with Morgan Harris's daughters, Cambria and Kira, when they came. I met with them privately first, before they took the stage and did their brave speeches about their mom and about the situation and the calls for action. And so we created that space at the AFN to make sure that that happened, because that, as I said earlier, this is a platform and we have to use it to bring forward the important issues. And so, I always keep a vision in my mind and in my heart of our girls and women being cherished, loved, safe, protected, and treated with dignity always. That to me is what I walk forward with. And so we do have the AFN Women's Council is doing work on MMIWG. We're going to be reporting on that a little more fulsomely in the new year. But it is definitely, and I support the situation in Manitoba. If any of us had our mom or our sister lying in a municipal dump, it would not be acceptable. It's absolutely not acceptable that be their resting place. We will not allow it to happen. And it's not going to happen. And so as the national chief, I'm going to do whatever I can to support Grand Chief Merrick, who I know is, doing great work in Manitoba on this issue, and others in Manitoba who are doing this work. They can count on me as the national chief to be there and to be a part of the solutions and the support that they need. And I believe that ultimately, if we are persistent and we are relentless on this issue, we will start to see the changes. So when these women are found, and their remains are found, and they're returned to their communities and they're given proper ceremony, then that will be a key point. That will signify things are shifting. And so I really want us to look at some of the solutions that are happening internationally. For example, in Washington State, there is a new alert system that they've recently adopted for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. When a woman goes missing, there's an alert system that happens. We have to start to enact these parts of the action plan under that MMIWG report, so that we can actually start to create this safety for our women and to meet that vision where our women are lifted up in this country. And being a woman national chief and having this platform and walking through these difficulties with as much dignity and grace as I can, which is something I learned from my mom, to me is a part of that journey. I'm a small part of changing the narrative of what it means to be an Indigenous woman in Canada. And I know that I get, calls and emails and text messages. And when I meet women, they talk about what it means to see me as the national chief, as a woman, and how much that affects them and gives them hope and gives them inspiration to do something in their own lives. So I think that, on MMIWG, we're going to work on the national action plan. We're going to make sure that those calls for justice are answered, and that we are substantially moving toward that vision of safe women across Turtle Island.
I have one more question for you. I know that you've been so generous with your time for today. This one is not going to be easy as well, but you've come out to reject the Trudeau government's very controversial new federal gun control bill. There are a number of gun-related tragedies that happen on First Nations every single year, and particularly this year in particular, that we're seeing a homicide crisis here in Winnipeg. What is the AFN's stance on gun control, and what's the best way to move forward with the issue of making sure that there's safe ways that we can handle guns, particularly for hunters in our communities?
First of all, we use firearms for hunting, and it's actually a part of our food security and our food sovereignty. I think that's what people have to understand, that these are not just guns when they talk about guns in the traditional sense. Firearms are tools for us, and they're not weapons. I think that's where there's a philosophical difference between the approach of gun legislation versus how it impacts our rights. And so for us, our rejection of certain firearms that we use for hunting, we need exemptions for First Nations. I grew up, I'm not sure if everybody else is like this, but I grew up knowing how to fire every single gun, a 22, 40-06, 410 shotgun, 12 gauge. So I know how to fire all of these big guns, and I was taught how to fire them safely. I was taught their purpose. I grew up, my father was, both my parents were hunters. And so we grew up with understanding that the gun was a tool for us to get our food, to have, our supply in our freezers for the winter sometimes. And so I think that the government has to figure out how to respect these rights that we have, because these hunting rights are actually treaty rights. They're mentioned in many of our treaties. And so you can't have a piece of legislation that negatively impacts that part of our lifestyle, because that is why we sign treaties. If you look at some of the dialogue that was happening during treaty signings, one of the most important things our leaders at the time said is, yeah, we can sign this document, but we have a way of living. We have a lifestyle. We have, a way of being in this world that we want to make sure that this piece of paper doesn't negatively impact that. And so what we've seen, of course, over time is this constant chipping away at that lifestyle, this constant sort of denigration of that lifestyle. And so I think that we're going to continue to stand up for our hunters, and the people who are harvesting in our communities for that fact alone. But does Canada need gun control in relation to violence within cities? Yeah, probably. But we have to find the way forward that it doesn't negatively impact us. But we want people to be safe, but we have a different view of guns. And that's what I think the general public has to understand, is these are not weapons for us, they're tools.
And you can't just write a legislation that's going to impact that and then never include people or never include First Nations till the back end, right? Till the legislation's already written, which is the exact problem in the first place, making paternalistic decisions for First Nations who are supposed to be partners in Confederation, but then just declaring a law and then going, well, that's you just all have to accept it. That's not what the treaties envisioned, and particularly is a good argument for what oftentimes the Royal Commission suggested, which is to have an Indigenous Parliament of some kind, or Indigenous peoples operating in collaboration, First Nations, particularly with the federal government when legislation's being drafted.
I did want to close out. There were a couple of things that I did want to circle back to. One of the things that we talked about earlier is what's it like to be the first woman. And I think that one of the things that I didn't really elaborate on is that, this patriarchy that I'm up against and the changes that I'm trying to make. And, I almost sort of like have a double challenge going on. One is that I'm a woman leader, and two is I'm a change maker. So change makers are often have difficulties moving things forward because of resistance. But as a woman, also the things that I have to deal with as a woman, many of the comments I've received, I say to people, if I were a male national chief, you probably wouldn't say those things to me because, for example, how you walk in the world. Men who are sort of take charge are like, oh, that's a good leader. A woman who's take charge is like, oh, she's aggressive. Like there's this kind of attitude towards women in leadership that I think has to change. And I do believe, though, that when you talked about this earlier about what is it like to be the first woman all the time, is even though these are difficult times, Niigaan, I feel built for this moment. I feel like every experience I ever had at all of those four levels before I got to the national level gave me skills, gave me perseverance, gave me a sense of relentlessness, gave me a sense of energy of what I need to do in this moment. And I've always said this, I feel built for this moment. And when I think about patriarchy, I just wanted to find this quote really quickly because this is what I think we're up against. And because I don't want to make it about men and women. It was Justine Musk, and I found it. She said, the enemy of feminism isn't men, it's patriarchy. And patriarchy is not men, it's a system, and women can support the system of patriarchy just as men can support the fight for gender equality. So it's our brothers out there that are standing with me, that are allowing me to keep moving forward. And I keep walking forward because people ask me, like, how do you keep doing this despite everything that you're going through? And I keep thinking about the women and girls, especially, who are ahead of me, and the women and girls who are watching me in communities, that they know that they can survive anything, that they can keep walking, that it's worth it for them, so that I can change the things that I am going through so that they don't have to go through that, so that they see a path, that next generation of sisters, that next generation of daughters. And I want them to see that women leaders are strong and they can persevere, that we're relentless, and that we can move forward, and that there's a space for them, and that this space will be a safe space for them when they arrive. And that's why I keep moving forward, is because I know there's a higher purpose of why I'm here. And I try and keep that in my work. I'm going to be doing a lot of community visits in 2023. I always visit communities because I want to be at that local level hearing what's happening, but I am also aware of this higher purpose and higher level that I sit at, and trying to bridge these gaps to make sure that my highest purpose is to create space, to create a safe space for women, for 2SL, for all of the people, people with disabilities. There are so many voices that we have to create space for at the AFN. And I just feel like the other thing I said at the AFN SCA is that I used to think of myself as like this relentless, like, okay, I'm walking through really hard and I'm kind of going through these difficult moments. But then it came to me in an epiphany that I am actually honoring the sacred connection that I have as a woman to water. And water flows no matter what. It just keeps moving. You cannot
around
stop
things,
water.
through things.
Yeah. And that's what I'm doing all the time, is I'm honoring that sacred relationship that I have with water by continuing to flow around these obstacles that are in my way, and finding new paths and carving new places. And even if you think about a hydro dam, people think, oh, well, let's look at a big hydro dam. The water stopped. No, the water is actually moving through the turbines underneath the ground. The water never stops moving, period. And so that's, to me, is what I'll keep doing for the rest of my term, is just keep walking forward, flowing around obstacles, and getting to the destination of this vision of our communities being happy, healthy spaces, Our children are happy and healthy. We're surrounded by the love of our families, living in these safe and vibrant communities. That's what I keep in my mind as I move forward.
I cannot tell you how much I appreciate the gift of your time. And I know that you've got back-to-back meetings, and so you were able to sandwich us in. On behalf of the Niigaan and Lone Ranger podcast, my partner Dan Lett, a huge miigwech to you for your time and for coming to us from all the way out there on the West Coast, dealing with the time change, and much appreciation.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. I really appreciate your time, and I'm looking forward to hearing the actual podcast when it comes out.
Thank you very much for listening to another episode of Niigaan and the Lone Ranger. A longer version of our feature interview with RoseAnne Archibald, the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, can be heard by going to winnipegfreepress.com and looking up the Niigaan and the Lone Ranger landing page. Thank you very much to all the people who helped make this possible, and that includes the great staff at CJNU, Nostalgia Radio, and also the support we get from people at the Winnipeg Free Press. Thanks very much for listening in, and we'll see you again very soon.